I want to continue building out the detailed game mechanics now and tying all those different classes together. The first thing I want to do is have a way of starting the game. So rather than having the enemies just instantly rush out as soon as we launch the program, I actually want some time to think about it, lay out the turrets, and then have a button that says begin game or something like that. For that, in the main file, I'm going to add an additional game variable. And this is going to be level_started. I'll set this to false to begin with. Now I can create a button to start the game. I'm just going to copy down the upgrade button image, and I will change this out to begin, well, it's not turret, so it's just begin_image, and then the file name is begin.png. Now we can go down to here where the buttons are being created, and again I'll copy down the upgrade one, and I'm just going to change the naming a little bit, so it's going to be the begin button, and it uses the begin image. I'll move it a little bit, so I'm going to change this 5 to 60, and then the Y coordinate I'll change to 300. Now we can go down and implement this inside of the game loop. Down here is where I'm drawing all the buttons at the moment, and I have this spawn enemy section. Right now the spawn enemy section is just run instantly. That's why the enemies come out as soon as we start the game. But instead I'm going to put this inside of an if statement. I'll add a comment first of all to say check if the level has been started or not. And this is where I'm going to use that variable we just created. So if level started is equal to false, meaning we haven't begun the level, then we want to display that button that we just created, which is going to be begin_button, and we'll call the draw method and put it onto the screen. And to check if this button has been clicked, I can just add an if statement to the beginning of it. If this button is clicked, then we want to change that trigger variable level started to true. And now I can put an else statement underneath here and indent all of this inside of it. Now, as long as this level started variable is false, we're going to be displaying the button and we're not going to spawn any enemies. But as soon as we click that button, this trigger switches to true and the else condition is now met, so we can start creating enemies. Let's run this just to test it out. So now nothing's happening, there's no enemies, and this gives me time to set up, put some turrets down, and then as soon as I click begin round, that's when the enemies start to come out. Now I want to go a little bit further and start actually tracking the enemies that have been killed or the enemies that have gone all the way through to the end of the path and they've been missed. To begin with, I go into the world class, and inside the constructor I'm going to add a couple more variables. First one will be killed_enemies, which will be set to 0 to start with, and the second one is going to be missed enemies, which is also going to be 0 to begin with. Well, this will allow me to track, first of all, how many enemies I'm spawning from before, but now how many of those I've killed and how many of those I've missed. Now we can look at how to actually track these. Both of these methods can be tracked from the enemy class. If we go in here, we already actually have a section here, which is our check alive method that looks at whether that enemy has been killed. Well, if it has, we're already passing the world class into it. So we can just say world.killedEnemies is increased by 1. And likewise, for any enemies that have gone all the way through and were just completely missed, we have a section up here in the move method where we're looking at whether the enemy has reached the end of the path. At the end of this one, we can do the same thing, but now it's going to be the other variable, which is missed enemies, and we increase that by 1. Now let's go back into the world class and just recap on this. First of all, we have this variable that's going to be updated at the beginning of the round, and it's going to tell us how many enemies we've spawned. But then we have a variable that tracks how many enemies we've killed and how many enemies we've missed. What I want to be able to do is track whether we've completed the wave. And the only way to know whether a wave is completed is by looking at how many enemies have been killed and how many enemies have gone off the screen. So basically, if there's no enemies left on the map anymore, that means that that wave is finished. We've got this variable here, which stores all of the enemies that we're going to create for this wave. And then we have two counters, one for how many we've killed and one for how many we've missed. So you might already see where I'm going with this. If I just add both of these variables together and I compare them to the length of this list, if they're equal, then that means that all of the enemies that have come out in this wave have been either killed or they've gone off the screen. Therefore, the wave is finished. Now we can implement that logic. I'm going to come down here and just above the draw method, I'm going to create a new method which we will call check_level_complete. and then we pass self as an argument, and this is just going to be one if statement. It's going to say if self.killed enemies plus self.missed enemies, if that total is equal to the length of the self.enemy list, then that means that that wave and that level is complete. We're just going to return true. Now we need to be able to call this method from somewhere. If I go back into my main loop, I can add it in down here. Where we were previously working on the level started variable, with this enemy spawning section, I can just go directly underneath that, add a comment to say check if the wave is finished. And this is where we call that method. We'll say if world.check underscore level underscore complete. If that returns a true value, then that means that all of the enemies have been dealt with. They've either been killed or they've gone off the screen. So we can set our level started variable back to false. Let's test all of this out now. I'm going to go back into the enemy data, and I'm just going to change it to have only one enemy so that we can run this a little bit quicker. If I run this and I drop a few turrets down, as soon as I begin the round, the enemy comes out and he's dealt with. Now the begin round button returns. So now I can start the new round because we've just detected, using the method that we just implemented, that the round is finished. That enemy was killed and there was only one enemy in that whole level. So now I can click begin round again, but nothing happens anymore. We don't seem to start the new wave. That's because we're starting the same wave. So we're basically just continuing where we already were. That enemy is already killed, so there's nothing else to follow up. We need to add a whole bunch of resets in this section. First of all, we need to move on to the next level. We already have a variable for that inside the world class, which is level. So I'll say world.level is increased by 1. Then we also need to reset a couple of variables. So one of them is that last enemy spawn variable. So this controls when the enemies come out, and it just gives it a little bit of a cooldown. Well, we reset this back by taking time.get underscore ticks. Well, that resets the variables that are in the main file, but what about the ones that are in the world class? So these variables here are important as well, because we track how many enemies we kill and we missed, but every wave we have to reset this back to 0. And to handle this neatly, I'm going to create a method specifically for resetting. We'll come down here and we'll define a new method called reset underscore level. We'll pass self as the argument, and then I'll add a comment to say reset enemy variables. So the first one is going to be the enemy list. I need to put this back to an empty list because each wave has different sets of enemies, and that's controlled by this enemy data file. So I need to clear what we had before and just start with a new list again. And then I just reset the variables from up here. So I'm actually just going to copy them down. It's the spawned enemies, killed enemies, and missed enemies. We're starting a new wave, so all of this needs to go back to 0. Now we go back into our main game loop, and we just continue this section here. So when a wave is completed, we reset a bunch of game variables, but we also want to run that world.reset underscore level method. That's going to set everything back again. It's going to clear everything out, but now we've moved on to the next level. So what we actually want to do is regenerate all the enemies for the new level. And that's done with a method that we've already used, which is world.process underscore enemies. If I just go back here to remind us what that does, it's down here. It just works through all of the enemy spawn data for that particular level. But because we've just moved up to the next level, it's going to go in here and it's going to go into the next one and say, okay, now we've got this many enemies, run through them all and stick them into this new enemy list. This should now give us all of the functionality we need to be able to start a level and complete a level and move on to the next one. So let's just visualize this and then test it out. I want to be able to display the level number on the screen. So I'm going to copy this draw text function that I've used for the health and the money, and I will just add in level. So all I do is move it down a little bit, and if we run this again, so now we can see this is the health, the money, and we're on level 1. So let's just drop down a few turrets and then begin level 1. The enemy will come through, gets killed, and now we've moved on to level 2. So in the background, all of that stuff with reprocessing the world has now been done. So back there in memory is now a new wave of enemies all ready to go. If I click begin round, we now get the next wave coming through. One other thing that I'd mentioned in the previous section is that whenever we kill an enemy, we gain 1 coin. But when we complete a level, there should also be a reward for that as well. I'm going to create a new variable in this constants file called level_complete_reward, and I will set this to 100 coins. Now we can go back into the main file, and in that section where we were checking if the wave is finished, right at the beginning, I'm going to award that money. I'll say world.money is increased by c.level_complete_reward. And now I'll just test this out. So I'm going to drop down a few turrets first of all, and then we've got 50 coins at the moment. So we'll run this game, and once we kill him, we gain 1. So we go up to 51, and then we also get 100 for the bonus for completing the wave. So we've got 151. Now we've got the mechanics working for checking if we've completed a wave, we've killed all the enemies, or maybe some of them got through. But what about the other way around? What about if the enemies get through and we lose? Well, I'm going to test this out by first of all going into the constants, changing the health down to 1, and then just to speed this up, I'm going to add an elite enemy to wave 1, just because they move a lot faster. So if I run this, we've got our health at the top, we've got 1 health, and this guy's going to get through defenses because we have none. So when we get to the end, this should just go to 0, and that's fine, but the game just continues. So if this guy goes all the way around as well, we're going to go to -1. So there's not actually any way of losing this game. To add that in, I'm going to begin with a couple of extra variables. We'll go up to the top of our main file, and up here where we're defining these variables, I'll create a couple new ones. So first will be game over, and I will set that to false. And another one will be game_outcome, which I'll set to 0, but I will add a comment to explain what it should be. So if I set this to -1, then is a loss, and 1 is win. So this way I'm just going to use this one variable to determine whether the game has been won or game has been lost. Now we can implement these variables. We'll go down to this section where we're drawing all of our buttons and we're checking if the level started and so on. All of this is kind of our game logic. So I'm going to add an overall if statement here to wrap all of this inside of. I'll say if game over is equal to false, well, that means that we want to continue doing all of this stuff. So as long as the game is running, we want to do all of these updates. We're going to highlight all of this stuff all the way down to the event handler, but just above it, and indent it by 1. Now, all of this only occurs as long as the game over variable remains false. Next, I need a way of checking whether the game is actually over. Because right now, this variable begins as false and it stays as false. We've got no way of changing it. I'm going to go into the updating section up here, and before we get into updating the groups, I'm actually going to do an initial check. I'll say if game over is equal to false, so just the same as what I did below, then check if player has lost. And this is based on the world health variable. If world.health is less than or equal to 0, well, that means that game is over. So we'll set game over to true, and I will also use that game outcome variable. And I'm going to set that to -1 because a -1 is a loss. I also don't want the enemies moving around and the turrets shooting the targets during this section. So if the game over variable is false, then all of this stuff also needs to be moved into the right. So all of that is indented inside the game over check. Now if I run this game and I just begin the round, we've got 1 health and you can see everything moving okay. But as soon as the enemy gets to the end, that will change the variable over to true. And that stops the game. So now the enemies aren't moving anymore. We can't put down any more turrets or anything. So effectively, it kind of looks like everything is frozen up. At that point in the game, we want to be able to display some kind of message to the player, some kind of feedback, and then an option to restart the game. For that, I need to first of all load in a new image for a restart button. We come up here and we'll just copy down the begin button. And I'm going to rename this to restart. So we can delete this and call it restart. Next, I'll go down a little bit to where my buttons are created, copy this one down, and I'll just do the same again. So this is now my restart button. I'm going to adjust the positioning a little bit so I'm not relative to the screen width anymore. I'll just set this to 310 and 300 for the Y coordinate is fine. Now I need to decide when I actually want to show this button. Well, the rest of the buttons are being drawn down in this section here. I have my if game over is equal to false, and that pretty much captures the entirety of all the button drawing that's going on. But the restart button should only come up when game over is true. So if the game is finished, we've lost the game, or we've won the game, we want to be able to see that restart option. And that means that this is going to be put underneath an else statement. So I need to line up with my if statement up here, scroll all the way down, and just above the event handler, with the correct indentation, I add in an else. This else section is when the game is over. For whether we've lost or won, this is what we want to display. First of all, I'm going to display a little rectangle on the screen. I'll say pg.draw.rect, goes onto the screen. Then for the color, I've just picked one of the named colors. So it's Dodger Blue. You can pick whatever you like for this. And then I need to define X and Y coordinates, a width and a height. And lastly, just to make it a little bit nicer looking, I'm going to add rounded edges to it, or rounded corners. I'll say border underscore radius is equal to 30. Then I want to display some text. But this text is going to be dependent on whether we've lost the game or we've won the game. For now, the only one I'm dealing with is a game loss. I'll say if game outcome is equal to -1, that means that the game has been lost. So the text I'm going to draw is going to be game over in all caps. Then for the font, I'm going to use the larger of the two. So this is going to be large underscore font. Color will be gray 0. And then the X and Y coordinates are 310 and 230. And underneath this, I'm going to add a comment to say restart level, because this is where I'm going to have my restart button. I can put my restart button in here, call the draw method onto the screen, and for now I'm not going to add any logics, I'll just say pass. So to test this out, I think a way of speeding it up actually is just going to set the health to 0. That means that I don't need to wait for the enemy to go round, just straight away the game is over. So this is looking like I want it to. I've got this little rectangle in the middle, game over, and then a restart game button. Right now clicking this does nothing, but that's what we can have a look at next. We're going to go into this section that I've had a pass inside of, and now we just want to reset everything because we're completely starting the game from scratch. We're not just moving from one level to the next, we're restarting the whole thing. That means a whole bunch of variables need to go back to the original state. First of all, game over goes back to false, seeing as we've just restarted. Level started also goes back to false to give us the option to prepare for the game. Then the other variables like placing turrets, that goes back to false. Selected turret goes to none. Then we refresh our last enemy spawn, which is pg.time.getTicks. So we're going to take a new timestamp. And then we even recreate our world instance because we want that to be completely reset. So we can say world. In fact, I can just copy this because this is what we already used at the very beginning when we first initialized this. I can just copy these 3 lines and put them inside this restart section. So just update the indentation. Now we're going to create our world instance, which essentially just resets it back to all of the original variables that we had in the constructor. We'll then process the data and we'll process the enemies. I also need to get rid of any enemies that are still potentially in memory, as well as clear all of the turrets. Because both of those are stored inside groups, I can just say, add a comment here to say empty groups, and then call the name of the group, which in the first case is enemy underscore group, and run the empty method. That's just going to empty out that group. So just like a list, this is going to empty out any of the contents. And I can do the same thing for the turret. Now to test this, I will need to set the health back to 1 because I actually need the game to run for a little bit. And I'm going to run it to this and I'll actually place a turret down just to see whether they get cleared out. So as this enemy runs around, I'm going to pick a turret as well just to see if everything goes back to fresh. So we've still got a turret in place. With this guy, everything is frozen, and then I'll hit restart, and now it's just back to how it was at the beginning. We've got 1 health, 650 money. Even though I placed turrets previously, everything has gone back exactly how it was. And if I click begin round, it just goes how it was from the beginning. Now we have a condition for game over. So basically, if we lose the game, we've got a way of handling that. But what if we complete the game? So not just finish a level or finish 1 wave, but we actually finish all of the waves. What happens then? In order to be able to work out whether I've completed the game, I need to know how many levels are actually in the game. We go back into constants and add a new variable called total_levels. And for now, I'm just going to set this to 1 to test it out. In reality, there's 15 levels that I've created, and you could actually expand this quite a lot. It's just the length of this enemy spawn data. So you could create as many more as you like, but I've limited to 15 for now. For the purpose of testing, we'll say that we only have 1 total level. We go back into our main file and into the updating section up here, and we add a second check. The first one was to check if the player has lost. Underneath that, I will add another one that says check if player has won. And this check is based on the current level. We'll say if world.level is greater than c.total levels, well, that means that we've completed all of the levels that were in the game. If that's happened, then I could just copy this down because the result is the same. The only difference is the outcome of the game is now a 1 instead of a -1. We now need to account for this in our reset section down here. So at the moment, we've got a check that says if the game outcome is -1, so if we've lost, then we display this text. Well, I'll add a second one, which will be elif game outcome is equal to +1. Then we do more or less the same thing, but we draw slightly different text. Now it's going to say, surprise, surprise, it's going to say you win in all caps. And because the text is slightly different length, I'm actually going to move it over to the right a little bit. So I'm going to position it at x coordinate 315. Now let's test this out, and just to make it a little bit easier for us, I'm going to get rid of that elite enemy, because now victory condition is based on us quickly completing this level, and since it's the only level, it's going to win us the game. So I'm going to place down a few turrets. This is our health, our money, and then the current level is 1. We'll begin the round. We kill the enemy, and now that's the same game over screen from before. So we've gone on to level 2, but of course there's only 1 level in total based on that new variable. So that triggers this game over section. If I restart, it's the same logic as before. So now we just restart the whole thing. And this really ties together most of these classes and brings together a lot of the game mechanics that we're missing. So the only things really left now are just to add on a little bit of polish and tidy up the display a little bit.